Hey everybody, and welcome back to my mega series on alibis. Today we are talking about the incompetence alibi. When constructing an incompetence alibi, your villain doesn't worry about establishing where he was at the time of the crime. Instead, the narrative he is trying to create is the villain was incapable of committing the crime. To examine this, let's take a look at an episode of Murdoch Mysteries called Bad Medicine. A doctor is murdered, and it turns out that he works at the Grayson Institute of the Mind, a psychiatric hospital where terror abounds. Soon after his death, a patient is murdered and then a nurse as well. But what's really interesting is that the killer seems intent on leaving clues for our sleuth, Murdoch, to follow up on. At the first murder site, the letters WY are clearly painted on a rock, and when that doesn't seem to be moving the case along fast enough, the killer goes ahead and mails the whole word, Wickham, to Murdoch's postbox at the precinct. It turns out that the Institute of the Mind once had another location on Wickham Road, which burned down, killing a woman who had been rendered vegetative in an experimental procedure that seems to be a very early lobotomy. The fire was arranged to kill her and thus to destroy the evidence of the terrible surgery to which she'd been subjected. But who's our killer? Well, it's this guy, one of the patients at the Institute of the Mind. He was the fiancé of the lobotomized woman, and he's been posing as a stroke victim so that he could get close to the people who victimized her and take his revenge.
It's you.
I wish you hadn't said that.
This is one of the many ways to set up an incompetence alibi in your mystery. The villain was never incompetent, but only pretended to be. Another way to do this is to establish that the villain truly was incompetent to commit the murder, but not at the exact time of the murder. In an episode of Monk called Mr. Monk and the Red-Headed Stranger, the only two possible suspects for a murder are Willie Nelson and Mrs. Mass, a woman who happens to be blind. Since the victim was shot from quite a distance away, the obvious suspect is pretty clear. But fortunately for country western fans everywhere, our actual villain is Mrs. Mass. She recovered her sight in one eye months ago due to a fall in the supermarket. That left her fully capable of shooting the victim. This is what I like to call a time-shifted alibi. At the beginning of this series on alibis, we talked about how time-shifted murders allow the villain to convince people that the murder took place at the same time as their alibi, when in fact it actually happened earlier or later. Well, a time-shifted alibi does the exact same thing. It makes people believe that the alibi and the murder are simultaneous. In fact, they aren't. Mrs. Mass had a valid incompetence alibi, but it was over before the murder took place. Using a time-shifted incompetence alibi is very fun because it lets your villain establish medical documentation that supports her alibi. In Bad Medicine, our villain simply faked being a stroke patient, and that would have been challenging enough. But Mrs. Mass could never have faked this alibi. It's backed up by her doctors, not to mention by the way she has lived her life for decades. If you feel like this video is giving you value, please smash that little like button, and then let's talk about the last way I know for your villain to construct an incompetence alibi. For this one, we'll get to look at an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, also known as my favorite Trek. In the episode Elementary Dear Data, some members of the crew are playing through a holodeck scenario that has Commander Data enacting the role of Sherlock Holmes. They come upon a murder victim who was certainly strangled, but when Data points out the villain, the inspector protests.
There is your killer, Inspector.
Holmes, poor woman hardly has the strength to strangle a man this size.
Not with her hands, no. But with this. When used as a garrote, these beads will make a mark quite similar to fingerprints. And, my dear Watson, you will note on the victim's throat, the marks are too evenly spaced to have been made by human hands.
So this way of breaking the alibi is to have the villain be incompetent under normal circumstances, but competent under some special circumstances. In this case, the woman was competent with the use of a tool. You could also have your villain be competent when your victim is in a certain position or under certain restraints. For example, if your victim was bumped off with an overhead blow to the head, well, your sleuth might start off his case by concentrating only on very tall suspects. However, if the victim was seated or crouching, a very short villain might become competent delivering your readers a delicious surprise. Incompetence alibis are an especially great way of hiding a villain in plain sight, allowing him to take on a role in your story without the reader ever considering him as a possible suspect. For more ideas about how to hide your villain in plain sight, you might want to check out this video next. We talked about 3 specific ways of allowing your villain to lurk in your story without ever being suspected. And we talked about how each of these methods can enlarge your story and turn it into something incredible.